I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. Will it be trick or a treat for Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi? We're on the eve of the Speaker's new Halloween deadline to pass the Biden package of infrastructure and social and climate spending. You'll recall she backed off on her own late September deadline after progressives refused to back the public works bill until the Senate passed the spending bill. A critical piece of the climate plan now seems dead because Joe Manchin opposes it. Democrats are having a tough time selling the plan because they don't know what's in it or how much it will cost. A Times headline noted, quote, debate weighs price of big bill versus not acting. And Sunday Times editorial said, quote, a Gallup poll last year found that 54% of Americans thought government should do more to solve the nation's problems, the highest level in the nearly 3-decade history of the annual poll. This year's results, released last week, showed that only 43% now support that statement. Not great news for Biden, whose poll numbers are weak. Reuters Ipsos has him with 46% job approval, 48% disapprove. So are the Democrats pushed by progressives? Are they going too far, planning to spend too much? And despite all the progressives versus moderates squabbling, will Biden ultimately get both bills passed? We're joined by Clyde Haberman, a contributing writer for the New York Times, and Eleanor Randolph, also a Times contributing writer. Eleanor, who is running this government? Is it Joe Biden? Is it Nancy Pelosi? Or is it Joe Manchin?
Yes, the answer is yes.
Yes.
Well, this people always talk about how hard it is to compromise. We're watching this in real time. And unfortunately, there's no compromising with Republicans. This is just among Democrats at this stage. But they'll get there. The first thing you do is you throw out the extremes and see how much of that you can get. And then you bring it back to the possibilities. That's sort of classic Washington compromise. To me, one of the things about Manchin that I really that concern me is that he's from West Virginia, and West Virginia has a really good system for support of mothers that go to work so that they take care of children there. And this bill adds money for that, and he seems to be resisting it. I think, that's not fair for the rest of the country. And it's the one thing I think Manchin could get really criticized about, but not in West Virginia, obviously, but in the rest of the country.
Clyde, what kind of system is it that we are sort of held hostage to one person trying to get reelected in West Virginia versus what's good for the whole country?
Is there a polite to way screwed up system? No, it's terrible. And that we have these two people, Manchin. I disagree with Eleanor a bit on Manchin. I think he is being incredibly short-sighted. What is being proposed, I don't know if it has to be $3.5 trillion as has been proposed or something less, but clearly we're at a time, not just in this country, but in the world, where we need a transformation in terms of the environment. And we're being held up by this coal guy in a state that is giving up coal fairly rapidly. It makes absolutely no sense. And then being held hostage by a woman who strikes me as being borderline wacko, namely Senator Sinema from Arizona. Who knows what she wants? She is totally inscrutable. And it's really a shame that we're at this point. If these weren't such critical issues, this is not just another highway to be built or not to be built. We are talking about the future of the planet here to a heavy degree. And to have the Republicans as a group stand in the way when an awful lot of them know better. And that's the part that disgusts me, frankly, and should disgust everybody. But to also have a few Democrats who normally you might be able to shrug off if the Democrats had 52 seats or 53 in the Senate, and we're stuck having to worry about what Joe Manchin had for breakfast and whether he's in a good mood today.
Eleanor, is bipartisanship the way to go, as Manchin keeps saying? Is there any alternative? What should Democrats in the Senate be doing? What should Joe Biden be doing?
First, let me agree with Clyde that that really the climate change part of these bills is really crucial. And Manchin's coal industry, he's absolutely right. It's shrinking by the day. I don't know whether you would ever get Republicans to go along with any of this. There are a few Republicans who think beyond the Republican speaker, and there are a few who are not afraid of Donald Trump. But whether they'll come out and actually support this, I don't know. There were earlier indications that some of the so-called Republican moderates, who are not that moderate, by the way, but that they would come along. But it doesn't look good at this point. I mean, it looks like you're going to need every vote, including the two that Clyde was talking about, the two
Obviously,
Democrats.
you need both sides pushing, so you wind up somewhere in the middle, but are progressives pushing too far, Clyde? And also, I'm not glued to C-SPAN. I have a life, I have a job, but whatever happened to Bernie Sanders?
Well, Bernie Sanders did an interesting thing by writing an op-ed in a West Virginia paper and basically going into Joe Manchin's backyard to argue with him. Manchin didn't take it very well. Look, I fall sort of in the middle between a lot of this. I'm not an AOCite by any means. And sure, you're going to have a bunch of leftist Democrats who are going to throw obstacles of their own. They have their own agenda. But in the end, nothing's going to get accomplished, obviously, without compromise. It seems to me like stating that the sun rises in the morning. It's so clear that either extreme is going to have to give. Again, the need is great. This is not just arguing over whether or not a road gets built here or there. We are talking about this very survival of our planet. I don't think I'm exaggerating on this. And so, yeah, it requires the leftists in the Democratic Party and the rightists like Manchin and whatever cinema qualifies as to sit down and act like grown-ups. And none of them are doing it now. And then, of course, you have this ultimate obstacle in Dr. No, Mitch McConnell, who is in the business of basically just getting conservative judges appointed and cares about nothing else except making sure that Democrats don't succeed at anything. And the Democrats, as you know, do not have much of a margin for error. They're 50-50 in the Senate. And they have a bare majority in the House, and off-year elections, as like the one coming up, are usually not good for the party in power. So if I were Joe Biden, I would be practically threatening to hold people hostage in the Oval Office until they come to an agreement. He needs a deal, and he needs it now.
That's a very good point. And we also had a story in the Times the other day that a number of House Democrats are retiring, perhaps because they see the control of the House going the other way. Eleanor, who has more power in Congress at the moment, Joe Biden or Donald Trump?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think that the Democrats have got to sort of shift their focus to not to each other, that what Clyde and I were talking about, that division within the Democratic Party, and start looking out beyond to 2022 when Trump is, is having these huge rallies and the Republican Party is congealing around him. And, okay, you might not get everything you want, AOC, but it's going to be a lot worse for you when the Trump Republicans take over the House and the Senate in 22. So get it done now. That's how
Makes
I feel.
some sense. Clyde, let me jump to a slightly different subject. Thomas Jefferson, the city council voting to remove his statue from the council chambers. Obviously, he was a slave owner like many of the founders at the time. We can also discuss his personal life and apply our standards, or maybe not, to what he did at the time. Where does that end? Where do we do an ex post facto assessment of what people did back then, or for that matter, what they do today?
Well, it ended for me a while ago, but clearly it hasn't for a lot of members of the city council who strike me as being symbol-minded. It is really not a terribly important issue. I don't have a strong feeling one way or another whether the statue of Thomas Jefferson stands in the city council chamber, where it's been for about 100 years, by the way. So it's not a new thing by any means, but I wish they would focus on a lot more substantive things than this. But it's where you draw the line. It's impossible to say. Do we get rid of every town that's named for Columbus, for example, including Columbus Avenue, which is a block away from me? Do we get rid of every statue of Jefferson and Washington and all the rest? The problem that bothers me is that when a lot of members of the city council here talk about, yeah, he was a slave owner. Yes, that's true. You know, he was a little bit more than that. The Declaration of Independence counts for something, in my view, and that seems to get ignored. He was complicated. All those guys were in many ways complicated. And it seems to me that the debate tends to be simplistic and simply say, he was a slave owner, that's it, end of story. No, it's not the end of story, and it shouldn't be for anybody with a sense of history and a fair-minded brain.
It would be fascinating if the city council sat down and debated whether it was worth keeping slavery for some amount of time versus keeping the Union at that time, 13 colonies into 13 states, which is really what that debate, to the most part, was all about. And the founders admitting that they were creating an imperfect union, but trying to keep that union together. Eleanor, tell me how it could be that Kathy Hochul is leading in most polls for governor next year, but the person who seems to be in second place in some of the polls, at least, is Andrew Cuomo.
Heaven help us, please. You know, I'm desperately hoping he doesn't read those polls and decide to run. What's interesting about Kathy Hochul, she hasn't really done very much. And maybe that's one of the ways that a politician does extremely well in this era. But she has touched all the bases. She goes to everything. She's all over the state. I don't think she's slept since she got appointed to that job, and she's gotten the support of the Democrats and the women's movement, and she's doing extremely well. She's really sort of putting it together in a way that is admirable for a politician. I think, you know, I mean, can you imagine what would happen if Andrew Cuomo decided, everybody loves me, I'm going to run? I mean, you know, certainly people in our business would be extremely busy for a while, because that's going to be crazy. The other thing is, nobody's really looking at the Republican side of that race. You know, Lee Zeldin is always, who is the congressman out in Long Island, has been sort of the front runner, although nobody knows whether he's actually completely well, and nobody knows whether he's really going to run. But we've got quite a while before that race really becomes front and center.
Yeah, I agree. And if I could just throw in, I mean, Kathy Hochul has yet to really be tested in her couple of months in office.
That's right.
She's continuing Cuomo policies in the main, undoing a few things, or hinting she might, like the planned train to the airport. But she hasn't had a crisis yet, except for the ongoing COVID matter. But she's still an unknown, I think, for most people. You know, if Andrew Cuomo were to jump in the race, I bet he'd do real well.
And
Oh,
of course, we don't know how well Bill de Blasio might do.
That
Thanks
too.
to Clyde Haberman, Eleanor Randolph of the New York Times. Coming up next, the Democratic candidate for Manhattan District Attorney. The Manhattan District Attorney leads an office that's one of the biggest and most powerful in the country. Past DAs have included legends like Tom Dewey, Frank Hogan, Robert Morgenthau. The overwhelming favorite to be the next Manhattan DA is Democrat Alvin Bragg. He'd only be the third person to hold that office since 1975. He served as first chief deputy of the state attorney general's office, also a federal prosecutor under Preet Bharara. In endorsing Mr. Bragg, the Times wrote, quote, Manhattan will need a distinctive kind of district attorney, one who knows how to use the levers of power to drive down the current spike in violence while moving forward with the hard and overdue work of criminal justice reform. The best person for the job is Alvin Bragg. The next Manhattan DA will also have to oversee the prosecution of Donald Trump's business, the Trump Organization, an incredibly high-profile case, to say the least. So if elected, what will his top agenda be? We're pleased to welcome him. And of course, he does still have a Republican opponent, Thomas Kniff, but he has a day one memo, Alvin Bragg does. What's on that memo? What would you do day one?
Thank you so much for having me. And yes, we wanted to be very explicit with the electorate about our plans. The memo has a focus on shrinking our footprint. More than 80% of the city's criminal docket are misdemeanor cases and below. Some of those are significant and serious, but many of them have little to do with public safety. So we want to shrink the footprint to go to some of the fairness issues that you mentioned, and then pivot to what I think is really on Manhattanites' minds, issues like gun trafficking, issues like sexual assault, and build the type of long-term, rigorous investigations that I have throughout my career that I believe bring enduring public safety benefits.
So if you shrink that footprint, what would you not be arresting people for or prosecuting people for?
I would say the footprint is in a few ways, right? So the first thing we need to do is cases that are brought, but that are motivated by substance use disorder and mental health, to really increase our diversion. Right now we have situations where people are being, prosecuted for a variety of crimes. They go to Rikers Island, our pretrial detention facility or misdemeanor detention facility for 3 months, and they come right back, and the cycle persists. So my thesis, born from my personal experience and professional experiences, let's divert those people into robust services so that we can end that cycle. That's a critical cornerstone.
Why is crime going up right now?
I think the first thing that all leaders have to do is admit when they don't know. And I think no one knows the answer to this, including me. I have my speculation, which is that we're in the middle of a once, certainly in my lifetime, and I think probably multiple lifetimes, calamity experience with our pandemic and the economic fallout. So that's my kind of working hypothesis. I think we'll know more when we look back at the data. But my view, my hypothesis is that this last 18 months will be anomalous, and part of my job as Manhattan District Attorney will be, a cornerstone of the job will be to get us back to downward incarceration and downward crime. That's the goal.
I remember talking to George Kelling, one of the originators of the broken windows theory, saying that he did not believe in zero tolerance, that you had to have the kind of discretion that you're talking about. How do you reconcile broken windows, zero tolerance, and equal justice? How do you get cops to be more discretionary the way they used to be, but also not abuse that discretion?
Right. One of the most interesting pieces is the look back piece done 10 years after the initial broken windows theory, when the statement was made, look, we said that you should fix the broken windows. We didn't say you should, incarcerate the kid who threw the rock. And so I think we got to look at all of the tools in the toolkits. A lot of that is officers talking to people and not reflexively being instructed to arrest. Some of it goes beyond the officer discretion and policy setting. So I'll just to give one example, you think of Eric Garner and arrested for allegedly selling loose cigarettes. That was an enforcement decision made at the very senior levels of the NYPD. When I was at the Attorney General's office, we took a different approach, hearing some of the same issues about this being something that we should address, public health, unpaid taxes. We investigated, ended up suing 2 carriers who were shipping thousands and thousands of dollars worth of untaxed cigarettes. We went to trial. No one died. No one's human dignity was impaired, and we got more than $100 million back for the public fist. So I think it's being creative with all the tools in the toolkit and all the levers of government power.
How do we be more creative in getting after bad cops? You ran a unit in the Attorney General's office. It didn't seem to be any more effective than what's been going on before. And who's protecting them? Is it the union? Is it the city? Is it the police department? And how do you change that?
So I think we took a big first step in the Attorney General's office, although you're right, there's more work to be done. I think the first step on all of this is sunlight. So we conducted our investigations out in the open in a way that had not been done really in the country's history, issuing reports when we didn't bring charges of all of our factual findings and all of our legal conclusions, and making recommendations for systemic policy changes. I'm told by stakeholders that really led to more trust in the system and the way those investigations were being done. But certainly that's not enough. I've been advocating for a change in the law. Right now, an officer can use lethal force, even if it's not a matter of last resort. I think we need to change that. And then we also need to be very diligent in our investigation. So in the DA's office, I would set up a freestanding independent unit that would report directly to me. We would do reports where we didn't bring charges like I did at the AG's office. But we also would look at, and we'd have much broader jurisdiction than I had at the AG's office, to look at systemic conduct, really yellow flags, working with the Civilian Complaint Review Board, looking at disciplinary histories, and investigating the way, much like we would another type of conduct, non-police conduct, building investigations and not waiting till the homicide, but intervening when there's an assault that shouldn't happen by a police officer. Another thing that I think is a gateway issue is police officers telling the truth. When I was a federal prosecutor, I prosecuted an FBI agent for lying. So I think we need to be vigilant in all of those matters before they arise to the level of a death.
Obviously, you haven't been privy to all the information about Donald Trump, the prosecution investigation going on in the Manhattan D.A.'s office. But from the outside, if you look at anyone carefully, they obviously have done things wrong. They've obviously made mistakes. How serious do these things seem to be against the Trump organization, and how close to Donald Trump himself do they seem to be?
So I don't know anything more than what's in the public domain, but I'm going to refrain from commenting on a case which I assume I will inherit. I assume it will not be resolved by the end of the year. So I don't want to talk specifically about it, but I can expand the lens out a bit and say, when I was at the Attorney General's office, I did do litigation involving Trump, the administration on policy issues, and then also the Trump Foundation matter, which I led, which led to a settlement and shine a light on what we believe was misconduct. So what I would say is that I stand prepared, having done complex white collar matters and jumping into the midstream and having litigated with a Trump entity in the past. But I think it'd be prudent for me to kind of just not comment on something I have not yet seen, and then I know I will likely inherit.
Who's running Rikers Island? Are the inmates in charge of the asylum at the moment?
I'm deeply concerned about Rikers Island. I think we have a vacuum at Rikers Island in terms of the leadership, really from the highest levels of our city. That's presented a really volatile, unsafe, and inhumane set of circumstances, both for those who work on Rikers, from our correctional officers to our medical staffs, to others providing social services, and to those housed on Rikers. It is an imminent, urgent crisis. And I think we needed all of the above, sense. I joined with the current district attorney in offering an op-ed on the Less is More Act, which the governor then signed into law, and that's allowed some folks who were in on technical parole violations. That's just a first step. We need to be reducing our census on pretrial detention. We need to be increasing our presence of officers and not having officers working triple shifts. And so that's going to take leadership. And I think we do need, this should be on every city leader's mind every moment of the day. It's an urgent crisis.
Thank you, Alvin Bragg. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.